The hold-up robber originated among bad men of the gold mining camps. Unsuccessful as a prospector, too lazy to work, and with enough bravado and criminal instinct to commit desperate crimes. He first robbed prospectors and miners en route on foot to stage stations of their gold dust and nuggets, becoming bolder, looting stages, and eventually, after the railroads were built, he held up railway trains and robbed express cars. We can also find them from the daredevils of the Civil War, those from the Southwest who engaged in guerrilla warfare, where, as the pride of the states which sent them to the front, and because of their ambuscades, raids, and lawless acts during the war, they were received as heroes when they returned to their homes. The James Boys, the Youngers, the Renos, the Farringtons, the war giving them the reckless life they longed for, and experience fitting them for the life of crime they inaugurated immediately after.
William Pinkerton understood the Western outlaw better than most. Son of Allen Pinkerton, who created the famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency, William was also one of its top men. And he saw firsthand how the experiences of the guerrilla fighters in the Civil War prepared many for life as dangerous, deadly outlaws. The upheavals of the Civil War had aftershocks that lasted decades in the West as well as in the East. After the war, thousands of Americans rushed west to claim lands under the Homestead Act of 1862. This put settlers and Native American tribes at odds once again, at a time when the federal government had already been at war with many of the tribes for years. Meanwhile, the tribes in the Indian Territory, which is today the state of Oklahoma, had not been in direct conflict with the U.S. When the Civil War began, the federal government withdrew its troops from the western forts, leaving the tribes unprotected from their Confederate neighbors. Many felt that they had no choice but to ally themselves with the Confederacy. And when the war ended, the federal government declared them to have violated the terms of their previous treaty, and the new, renegotiated treaty left the tribes with less land and a transcontinental railroad running straight through it. The end of the war also saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and similar militant white supremacist groups that used terrorist tactics to intimidate, beat down, and kill former slaves and the Republican agents of the Freedmen's Bureau who went south to enforce the changes of Reconstruction. But in the world of outlaws and lawmen, the Civil War played a major role in teaching a generation of future bandits how to rob, kill, mutilate, and terrorize their enemies. Fortunately, the war also imparted skills to those who would stand against the tide of chaos, and they would become the lawmen of the West.
The raid occurred on the morning of August 21st, 1863. It was a clear, warm, still morning. The guerrillas reached Lawrence just before sunrise after an all-night's ride from the border of Missouri. Myself and family were yet in bed and asleep. They passed directly by our house, and we were awakened by their yelling and shouting. I got up and went to the window to see what was the matter. And as I drew aside the curtain, the sight that met my eyes was one of terror. One that I shall never forget. The bushwhackers were just passing by my house. There were 350 of them, all mounted and heavily armed. They were grim and dirty from their night's ride over the dusty roads and were a reckless and bloodthirsty set of men. It was a sight we had somewhat anticipated, felt that it might come, and one that we had dreaded ever since the commencement of the war. I turned to my wife and said, "The bushwhackers are here."
The Civil War in Kansas and Missouri was very different from the war in the East. Bands of armed men had been crossing the Missouri-Kansas border since long before the Civil War had begun. The pro-slavery bands were called border ruffians, and the free soilers were called jayhawks or redlegs. They were all bushwhackers. These rough men had only become rougher during the war.
No more terrifying object ever came down a street than a mounted guerrilla wild for blood. The bridle reins between his teeth or over the saddle horn, the horse running recklessly, the rider yelling like a Comanche, his long, unkempt hair flying wildly beyond the brim of his broad hat, the firing both to the right and left with deadly accuracy. When the town was filled with such men bent on death, terror ensued. Reason and judgment fled, and hell yawned.
On August 21st, 1863, a band of guerrilla raiders under the command of William Clark Quantrill tore through the town of Lawrence, Kansas. Long a supporter of abolitionists, Lawrence was attacked in retribution for a smaller assault by Union guerrillas in Osceola, Missouri. Approximately 200 people were killed during the Lawrence massacre, most of them unarmed civilians. The bushwhackers, both Union and Confederate, killed without remorse, soldier and civilian alike. They each committed horrifying acts that only encouraged the other side to do even worse. Bushwhacker Jim Cummins gives a sense of this in his writing about his thoughts while deciding to join a guerrilla band.
In the year 63, I was at home in Clay County, Missouri with my mother. I had two brothers in the Southern Army who came to see my mother, and she was accused of harboring bushwhackers. Her neighbor boys who were in the Army would come to see her, and she would feed them, and she was accused of feeding bushwhackers. They accused my uncle, who had never taken any part in the war, of harboring bushwhackers, and took him from the threshing machine and shot him and then jumped their horses over him and left the prints of the horses' shoes on his body. Having looked the situation over, I determined to join the worst devil in the bunch. Frank James had joined Quantrill's band. While he was fierce, he was nothing compared with that terrible Bill Anderson. So I decided it was Anderson for me, as I wanted to see blood flow in revenge for the outrages the Jayhawkers had committed. You talk about Quantrill, Todd, and Taylor being reckless raiders and fighters, but Anderson I thought was worse than any of them when I joined him.
Bloody Bill Anderson certainly lived up to Cummins' description. But in addition to the indiscriminate slaughter of unarmed men, his tactics also included outright robbery, including stagecoaches and trains, and setting an example for outlaws to come. The first peacetime train robberies in the U.S. didn't occur until after the Civil War. But it was one more practice that outlaw gangs had learned during their time as guerrilla fighters. One instance of a train robbery by Bill Anderson's gang included the soon-to-be famous Jesse James, was also the scene of one of the worst massacres in the war. Anderson had led about 80 of his guerrillas into the town of Centralia, Missouri, on September 27, 1864. They were dressed in blue so that they might be mistaken for Union militia. This is from the history of Boone County, Missouri.
At last, Anderson gave the command to have the soldiers taken to the south side of the railroad and formed in line. The passengers were ordered to leave the train, and they huddled in groups about the grounds adjoining, clinging to each other and not daring to leave without permission. A few, seemingly stupefied or paralyzed with horror, remained in the cars, some of them crouching beneath the seats. "What are you going to do with them, fellas?" Arch Clements asked Anderson, alluding to the soldiers who stood trembling in line. "Parole them, of course," returned Anderson, with an ironical and sardonical emphasis on the word parole.
They pulled one Union soldier out of line, Sergeant Thomas Goodman. He was intended to be held to trade for one of their own who had been captured.
And now Arch Clements began to carry out Anderson's orders and to pour hell into the prisoners. Probably 25 men opened on the doomed line with revolvers at 20 paces. Expert pistol shots as they were, many of the guerrillas missed their aim. A dozen of the prisoners, shot through the brain or the heart, fell dead at the first volley. Others screamed and staggered about with a hand pressed to their wounds until shot again and again, they tumbled lifeless to the ground. With cheers and shouts, the guerrillas now began to depart for camp. Every one of the guerrillas had plunder of some kind, and many of them had a good deal: greenbacks, gold watches, jewelry.
The Union soldiers dead and plunder gathered, Anderson and his guerrillas rode out, leaving the train depot burning. But even then, the day's slaughter wasn't over. Major Andrew Johnston and a battalion of the 39th Missouri Infantry arrived in town on a separate train that same afternoon. Upon seeing the devastation wrought by Anderson's guerrillas, Johnston set out with over 100 men hot on Anderson's trail. In fact, he had been hunting the guerrillas already. Unfortunately, Anderson knew that. In addition to the plunder, the strike on Centralia had been in large part a reconnaissance mission. If he found federal troops, he was to fight them. Before Johnston could catch up to Anderson, the guerrillas' chief scouts reached him with the news he had been waiting for. Anderson had joined up with another band of guerrillas, and now 400 lay in ambush. The Union troops were carrying muzzle-loading rifles. Deadly accurate at a distance, they were slow to reload. The guerrillas were all carrying multiple-shot revolvers. When the Union soldiers dismounted to prepare to fire, the guerrillas rushed in on horseback and slaughtered them.
In some respects, the Centralia fight has no parallel in the annals of the Civil War. It was the wildest and the most merciless, and in proportion to the number of the force vanquished, the most destructive of human life. Out of a total force of only about 90, which was in line of battle, and 30 others detailed to hold horses in the rear, 108 fell before the remorseless revolvers of Todd's and Anderson's men. Men who, fresh from the horrible scenes of blood and pillage and fire at Centralia that morning, were prepared for other scenes of carnage on a larger scale in the afternoon.
That carnage continued after the Union soldiers were dead. Sergeant Thomas Goodman, who eventually escaped, later reported.
Men's heads were severed from their lifeless bodies, exchanged as to bodies labeled with rough and obscure epitaphs and inscriptions, tied to their saddle bows, or sat grinning at each other from the tops of fence stakes and stumps around that scene. The fiends of hell itself could not exceed the spectacle and enormity of conception, or horror and brutality of execution.
Such were the teenage years of the boy who would become the most famous outlaw in America.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.